Hello, fellow creators. What's one thing they don't teach you and they don't teach us about our children? See, in today's world, with science advancing so much and tech advancing so much, we still want our kids to feel the ways of mystery, the ways of wonder, to understand everything in the cosmos, and to eventually understand that they can be creators and architects themselves. And while that can be difficult sometimes, here's Dr. Joe Dispenza on how to do that and his experiences with it.
Children's brainwave patterns tend to be very unique because for the first 6 years of their life, their brainwave patterns are so slow that they're functioning in their subconscious mind. We know as a scientific fact now that the sperm and the egg gather information from both donors moments to hours before conception, and that the emotion that both parents are experiencing tend to cast the first genetic die. So if the parents are living in those survival emotions, those emotions of stress that create anger and aggression and hatred and judgment and fear and anxiety and pain and suffering, hopelessness, powerlessness, those altered states of consciousness, I call them, but psychology calls them normal states of consciousness, that if we live in those hormones of stress, then that casts the first genetic imprint, because the child then has to be prepared for the same environmental conditions that both parents are embracing at that time. You understand? So as they experience their environment, and the end product of every experience in the environment is called an emotion, then the emotion tends to imprint into what's called the haploid cells, the sperm and the egg. And that's actually called genomic imprinting. So what is then, conceived in the flesh is born of the flesh. And what is conceived in the spirit is born of the spirit. So ancient traditions, like the Native Americans in the United States and certain cultures in the Mideast, understood this principle, and they separated both donors or both parents before matrimony, not because they wanted to increase their lust, but because those two had a real firm intention about what they wanted to contribute to the culture or the community or the tribe. And so they began to look at the emotions that limited them, the emotions that kept them lost in confusion or anger, and they fasted from their emotions. And they separated themselves from the tribe long enough that they began to embrace elevated emotions, the emotions of love and gratitude and loving kindness. And they said, I want to contribute the best to the tribe because I would love to have the chief or the wise woman or the medicine man or somebody to be able to lead the tribe. And so when they consummated their love, they did it with an intention to propagate a species for evolution. In the consummation of their love, then, it wasn't 1 and 1 is 2, which is how survival emotions work. It was 2 is 1. And so it was a lot of giving, and that kind of embracing of love allowed the child to begin to get the first genetic impression as the organism began to develop in utero. And as now the child begins to develop in utero, we now know as a scientific fact that the mother's blood flow is in constant communication with the fetus. And as the mother is experiencing the environmental conditions once again, if she's experiencing the stress hormones, then that the stress hormones begin to shape and mold the physical structure of the baby. So we know as a scientific fact also that the children that are under stressful conditions, whether it's poverty or fear or aggression, that they're born with a smaller head circumference, smaller frontal lobe, larger adrenal glands, weakened immune system. Because once again, the emotions that are created from the mother, the thoughts and behaviors, begin to further imprint the gene because it's preparing the child for the same environmental conditions that the mother is embracing for better chances of survival. So then, once maturation is reached in utero, then the next thing, of course, is partition or birth. And there's been tons of research to show that it's either going to be elegant or forced. It's either going to be produced in an environment that allows the child to transition smoothly, or it's going to be abrupt and cold and insensitive. And I remember when my two older children, I moved to a very rural community in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and I started reading books on natural childbirth, and I wanted to do an underwater birth. And all I needed was a midwife there so that I could facilitate the birth of the child, catch the baby. And I can't tell you how many midwives I interviewed 22 years ago and talked to them about underwater birth, and they thought I was absolutely insane. And yet, two of my children were born underwater, and I can tell you that when they transitioned into that warm water, it was an amazing experience. And my daughter, who's 22 years old, came out with the veil still over her, and I held that umbilicus, and she floated, and I allowed her to be comfortable in the water. Then I turned her over and lifted her up out of the water, and she is a very cosmic kid to this day as a result of it. So transition then should be done in a state of grace, in a state of allowance, and it should be done with the environment supporting that transition. We also know that we have three types of stress: physical stress, trauma, injury, accidents. We have chemical stress like blood sugar levels, flus, bacteria, viruses, heavy metals, pesticides, pollutants, hormones. And we have emotional stress. And stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis, and stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. So it makes sense then that before birth, as the mother is experiencing her gestation, that it's not a bad idea to make sure that all three of those things are in check: physically, chemically, and emotionally. And we know as a fact scientifically that mothers that tend to stay in that range, where they're experiencing the feeling of being nurtured and taken care of, that they're doing the proper nutrition. Of course, there's tons of research on that. They're getting the proper structural care, they're doing yoga, they're breathing, they're taking care of themselves, that they tend to give birth in a more elegant way. Now, after birth, there's this amazing dance that takes place between nature and nurture. And we know also, as the child is reared and the child is born, that they have certain genetic propensities because they inherit both the physical characteristics of both parents as well as the emotional propensities and tendencies. And isn't it ironic then that they're raised by the same parents with the same emotional propensities, and that reinforces them in their environment? Children's brainwave patterns tend to be very unique because for the first 6 years of their life, their brainwave patterns are so slow that they're functioning in their subconscious mind. And children actually learn through their subconscious mind because everything you tell them for the first 6 or 7 years of life, they accept as true because they have no analytical facilities to be able to process what you're telling them. As a matter of fact, all of their awareness is on their internal environment, and they notice changes in how they feel inside of them. And when they feel differently inside of them, it perks their brain up and they pay attention to whoever or whatever caused it. And that event in and of itself creates a memory, and the repetition of exposures over time begins to create what we call habits or behaviors. So then your children have a type of neurons that I've always been fascinated with, and they're called mirror neurons. They're empathy neurons. And empathy neurons means they're going to model what you do more than what you say. And when a lioness is training her cubs on how to hunt, she doesn't say, okay, you two go that way, and you go around that way, and I'm going to attack right here. She says, watch what I do. And because of that, mirror neurons then begin to install the neurological hardware, because as your children observe what you're doing, they're turning on the same circuits in their brain as if they were actually doing it. And that begins to prime the brain and begin to create what's called neural Darwinism, which means you begin to prune away the circuits to begin to shape and mold behaviors. And that's the beginning stages of plasticity. So then right around the ages of 6 and 12, brainwave patterns pick up and they move into what's called alpha brainwave patterns. Now, alpha patterns tend to be, according to the research, where children believe in the imaginary world more than they believe in the outer world. In other words, the inner world is more real than the outer world. And you can tell your child to act like a rabbit or act like a princess at 9 in the morning, and it's 7 in the evening, and they're still acting like a rabbit and they're still a princess. Yes? Because the inner world of imagination, because of brainwave patterns, is where the brain begins to interact in the cognitive way to begin to interface with the external world. And Rudolf Steiner's work, Steiner, who created the Waldorf schools, he was very interested in elongating the alpha time. And because in alpha, you're able to begin to interface between the real world and the imaginary world. Now, right around this time, as your brainwave patterns begin to pick up, and the child is beginning to interpret the laws of the environment, he or she is interacting with the external world, and they're beginning to skin their knee or put their finger in the light socket, and they notice pain inside of them, and it wakes them up, and they look to see through their senses what caused that experience, and the senses begin to write the script neurologically in their brain. And so after a series of exposures, the child cries out, it's uncomfortable, and gets fed and learns to associate crying out with being fed. And so every time she or he is hungry, she cries out and gets fed, and we begin to then develop these positive and negative identifications and associations that give rise to habits and behaviors. But right around this age of around 10 or so, 7 to 10, the analytical mind begins to form. And as the analytical mind begins to form in the child, they begin to interpret the laws of the environment. So they begin to interpret the laws of the environment because their analytical mind begins to form. The critical facilities begin to develop. And the critical mind, or the analytical mind, begins to separate the conscious mind from the subconscious mind. Now, the subconscious mind is made up of all those positive and negative identifications and associations that give rise to habits and behaviors. And that's 95% of who we are by the time we're adults.
Welcome back, fellow creators. So I hope that gave you some insights, and I hope that shows you that one thing they don't teach you is that while genetics do exist, epigenetics can play a bigger role. You can use consciousness to change these genetics that were not even thought possible. And definitely the way you bring your children into the world and emotionally condition them, work with them, play with them, interact with them matters. So let them know that they, themselves, can be amazing creators, that they have the power of consciousness, and that they are an amazing expression of this universe, just like you are. And then by doing that, little by little, and engaging with our children and future generations, they can engage with their children and future generations. Just imagine how amazing this world can be when we all realize that we are creators and we can create through the power of a clear intention with elevated emotions. So be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, like this video, leave me a comment below. All the best, guys. Thanks for watching.